around to it. All right, so I'm actually going to jump into my many-to-many DTO, so user session. Oh yeah, the order, I remember that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say that this user session object has two properties. It has a user object and a session object. So what I'm going to say here is I'm going to do public user get set one get public session. All right. So I've now defined these, and these are essentially my foreign key objects. Then from here, I'm going to add, I'm probably going to do this backwards. I feel like I always do. I'm going to put the attribute here. It's a foreign key attribute. And what it looks for is it's going to define the name of the foreign key field. So this is my user property. And the foreign key is which other property within this class. So it's not the name of the field, but it's the name of the property. So the user foreign key, to find that user ID, it needs to look at the user ID property up here. Right? Because that's where that foreign key actually lives. And the same thing with session. Okay? So what's happening is that I now have the foreign keys configured on these two properties. And this is where it gets weird, because you may go, okay, well, I just told it what the foreign key fields are, but how does it know how to go and find it? Well, that's why on our user DTO and session DTO, we define the ID property as the key. So it actually knows, it builds a map internally. It says, well, if it's a user DTO object, the key for the user DTO is this ID property. And therefore, the foreign key is user ID and user session, so those are foreign key, primary key pairs. So when I write a query to go grab that user, I'm actually going to be querying the users table off of that ID. Does that make sense? So it's literally just making that same connection that you make when you're building your database. It's just kind of doing it a little intuitively based on the way that you've built out your DTOs. All right. So what I'm going to do, because really the only good way to see this is in the debugger. What is it? Ooh. I'm going to make another action. I'm going to call it demo. No, I don't want to generate a class. I did this last time, didn't I? Capital B, capital B. Using. So context dot user sessions select, and I'm going to do first or default. Var first user session. Which O equals null. Alright, so I'm going to put my breakpoint on this line, just because I need a line of code to do the breakpoint. Just scroll up. But what's happening here is I'm just going to grab the first session object out of that table. just to show that that many-to-many is now wired up. I'll go ahead and run. New expression required after. Say that again? Oh, yes, thank you. I was so busy worrying about the IntelliSense, I forgot. Then I got to return a view. Return view. Return content demo over. All right. All right, so if I go up here, and I'll just go home/demo, just hit my breakpoint. And if I just peek into this object, they're both null. Awesome. All right. That means I put my foreign keys on the wrong spot. Put them in the wrong spot, so let me flip back. I'll put them up here. That one goes there, that one goes there. F6 rebuild, F5 rerun. So these foreign keys, that's where I always get it mixed up. So the foreign key attribute goes on the foreign key ID field, and it points to the property that is the foreign key. So foreign key, the user ID has a foreign key attribute, user, and that points to this property, saying that that user property is where the foreign key is loaded. The other piece that I always forget is you can put virtual here. And what that does is it provides you the ability to do what's called lazy loading. And while this rebuilds, what lazy loading does for you is instead of going and fetching all of the database data up front, the entity framework goes through a series of mechanics where it actually inherits your class and it takes all of the virtual methods and builds lazy loading property overrides. And the lazy loading basically says that I'm not going to go out to the database and fetch the data until that property is called for the first time. So if the user session has a user and that user has another property and that user property has another property, if there's a chain of tables or joins that occur, then what will happen is without the lazy loading, every table gets fetched, pre-fetched. And all of that data comes back into your model right away. Well, if you never use half of those properties, you fetched a whole bunch of data from the database that you never need. So instead, by using lazy loading, you make more calls to the database, but in theory, you're going to consume and pull less data because you're only pulling what you need on demand. Yes?
So that make things faster then by not pulling as much data, or is it slow it down by having to make so many calls?
You get improved performance because your initial call is lighter, right? Less data, and then there's math involved, but basically the idea is assuming that more likely than not, you're not going to use all of those lazy calls. You may not use any of those lazy load calls, and if you don't, your performance is exponential. Okay. And then for the times that you do make the call, it's going to be negligible because you have to open another connection. Okay. And then there's going to be rare cases where you're going to do some concurrent calls and pull all that data, and therefore you're going to need to make multiple calls. And there's actually ways around encumbering that hit up front, where you can tell it to go ahead and do the lazy calls aggressively, get them up front, and then you don't have to worry about fetching it later. Gotcha. So if you know that you're going to need the data, you have a way of going and fetching it all at once. All right, so home demo. There we go. So you'll notice here, and I'd have to go back and look, but you notice now that I mouse over this variable, first user session, it's now of type system.data.entity.dynamic.proxy.user session underscore and a giant hexadecimal string. That's the name of our class. That class is a dynamic proxy that the entity framework made. You may be like, all right, what's that mean? Again, without getting into all the minutiae of what it is, the entity framework actually dynamically writes C# and compiles it at runtime, inheriting our original DTO class. And that code that it dynamically writes and compiles becomes this class that we actually get back. And because of inheritance, you can stick a derived class inside of our base class variable. And this derived class has the lazy loading proxy functionality in those properties that are virtual. So that time that it took for it to spin up and do all that, it actually created its own class, wrote it, compiled it, inherited from our class, and then pumped it with the data needed to go out and fetch. Here's our session DTO, and there's our user DTO. So we now have those foreign keys. Okay. So that's a good start. So in cases back in our controller where we had to make subsequent calls to get the session or user data, let's go back to our registration controller real quick and take a look. So I do this work here of just get those sessions. So the step prior is me going and grabbing user sessions based on user ID and session ID. It's perfectly fine grabbing those. But then I make another complete call where I'm going out and grabbing just those sessions and then doing a select and creating a whole view model for it. This additional context sessions where that can all be replaced by simply using the results of user sessions and saying take the session out of user sessions because it's in there, it's part of that class. So let me show you what that looks like. So these two lines of code can basically be removed. And now I can just say selected sessions. And then what I'm going to say here is I just select the session ID. So how do I want to adjust that? So what I could do here, actually we could probably get rid of most of this block. We could combine it. So I'll leave this here, I'll comment it out. So I can actually say select session. I might actually be able to do one better. We could say, let's try this. So our row here is a user session. So I can now say row.session.name. Copy that. Comment that line out. We'll now call toList. I'll replace this. F6.
So here it says user session does not contain the definition of session.
You have name as a lowercase session.
Oh, thank you. Yes, you're right. And this didn't autocomplete. I don't. Oh, to list async. There we go. Okay.
So now here's where you run into issues where you have a lack of lazy loading. So what's going to happen here, we can try running it, but it'll probably fail, is we're going and grabbing user sessions, and then we're doing aware, and then this select block is going to generate some code, some SQL code. And what's going to occur is that this select block is going to try to build a session from data that doesn't exist yet. So what I need to do is I need to aggressively fetch session, the session property, along with user session.
So let me get that coloring out of the way. And to do that, there's an include method. And basically I say include the session property when you go to the database and make that call. Yes?
So would you not have to have done this if you didn't put the virtual on there?
Correct. If I hadn't done the virtual, it would have aggressively looked. It would have brought it in every time. But, so here's the other side of the virtual now. At no point am I using the user data. I'm not using that user property. So if I didn't put the virtual on either one, then it would have loaded the user data every time as well as the session data. Doing it this way, it's not going to load the user data unless I need it, which in this case I don't. And then I can choose to aggressively load the session data.
Would you add to user DTO?
What did I add to user DTO?
Yeah, for the forward column.
I didn't add anything yet.
User session.
User session. I put foreign key attributes on user ID and session ID, and then I added the two
Properties of user and session, which are my virtuals as well.
All right, so let's rebuild. Let me sign in. I still don't have a registration link on my view. So that view is now using the new code. So it functions the same way as before, but I was able to take that entire additional select block and context call and all of that out by adding the virtual property and making some minor modifications. I basically condensed my code into one call. Right, so before I was making two calls, I was getting just those session IDs, and then I had to make that secondary call down here just to get those sessions. And I was using the ID to do the filter, and then I was creating my view model. In this case, I said grab the user sessions, include the session, virtual, that property, filter on the user ID, so only grab my sessions, and then create my view model and return that list. Consolidating that code, consolidating that work. Took a little bit on the front end, but now we can do that in other capacities as well. All right. So now what I want to be able to do from here is I want to be able to get a list of user session. And the same thing from user. So let's actually go over here first. So I'm in the user DTO. So I'm going to go public virtual list of user session. And I'm just going to call it user sessions, plural. Okay. I'll do an F6 to rebuild. And then come back into that registration controller. And let's take a look here real fast. So to remind ourselves of what we did here, so this is the index, now it's the post back. That's not what I want. So let's get all sessions, and that's fine. So on submit, we grab the logged in user, and then we loop through all of the selected sessions, which we captured up here. And then we're basically looking to see, is there a user session for this user and for that session ID. Checking user sessions. And then we save a new session. So that will leave, it would be a little more complicated to incorporate. But let's go back to this one for a moment. So same chunk of code. So we now are looking at pulling out the registered sessions for this user. The first step is get the logged in user by ID. So we get that user, we're just pulling the ID from here because then we get down here and we say grab all the selected sessions. Well, let's consolidate that, right, into another one call. So what we can do here is we'll keep that part and we'll comment that part out. So what we want to do is we want to grab the user based on that username. What I then want to do is I want to select from my user sessions. So what that's going to give me is an iQueryable of user sessions. Well, that's what I end up getting down here. So now I could simply just grab this and append this here, and then take this session VMs and put it up here. And now this whole line, this whole chunk here, I can comment out as well. So now what I'm doing in one block of code is I'm saying, grab all the users and get me the user where the username equals that user identity name. Same thing we did before. How do we fetch the user? So this will directly grab me that user. Well, from that user, go ahead and just select, actually, think about a query. Select user sessions.star from users joined by user sessions where user ID equals whatever, or username equals that string. That's what this chunk is doing. And then we're doing a secondary query where we're saying, okay, take user sessions, and now just select the session from that user session and pump it into a new user session view model and then give me a list of that view model. That's the end goal. So instead of doing it in 3 chunks, opening 3 contexts, doing 3 queries, I can do it in one complete call. Now, there's 2 things that I need to do to make sure that this works effectively, because now I'm doing a large fetch and I don't want to lazy load. So I do include row.userSessions. And I can stack these. I can do another include
row.usersessions dot. Oh, it won't let me do that. How do I do that? Because that's a collection. I do it this way. String path. User sessions dot session. So my collection of user session does not contain a definition of session. Because, oh, I forgot to select. Select x dot, why isn't it not going to do it? So x is a list of user session. I think this is supposed to actually be, I was getting ahead of myself. Let's try an I collection. So we have a collection of user sessions, and each one of those user sessions has a session. So what we actually have to do, we have like a nested collection is what it turns into. Because what's happening now is I'm saying, grab this user and then grab these user sessions from that user. That user can have multiple user sessions, right? They could be assigned or registered to multiple sessions. There's a record for every session they signed up for. So what I'm actually ending up with is a collection of sessions. It's what the entity framework is saying. Because I have a collection of users and that user has a collection, therefore there's a collection of sessions. There's a nested collection of sessions per user. So what I have to do is user sessions, I have to do a select. So there's another routine called select many. And what it what it consumes is a collection, and then it allows you to dissect that collection. It actually flattens the collection, so it gives you a single list instead of getting a list of lists. All right. So I'm going to break this out and then dissect it a little bit for you. USC, USC, US1, US1. All right. So what's happening here is, so up to this point, we're saying context users, get all user sessions, aggressively load. User sessions, that session, aggressively load. Load both sessions and user sessions aggressively. Now, of that, where username equals user identity name, grab all of the user sessions that are tied to that particular user that's logged in. Everybody's with me up to that point, right? Select those user sessions are tied to that user. So just grab those user session objects that are tied to that user. I don't really care about the user except for I'm using it as my entry point. So now I have a collection of user sessions. The way the Entity Framework thinks about that is you still have a list of user sessions. And what I want is I want the user out of every one of those user sessions. So what I have to do is I have to do a select many off of the collection of user sessions. Because each one of those user sessions has a session. So this is the collection, the user session collection, USC. And I want to do a select out of that collection and grab just the session object. So of the USC, I need to do a select and grab from just one user session object, user session 1, grab its session. So I have to grab the session off of the user session, the single user session object, out of the entire collection of user sessions, which is based on the collection of users that it's tied to. So you've got this weird multi-tiered nesting that's happening where you have one-to-many tied to one-to-many tied to one. So if you saw it in a database, you would have the users table here with a one-to-many to user sessions with a one-to-many on the other side of session. Well, the query doesn't know that I'm getting back one user. It thinks I'm getting back a whole table of users. And each one of those users has a collection of user sessions, and each one of those user sessions has a session. So there's this weird collective nesting. If I said give me all active users, get all of their user sessions, and then give me all of their sessions, this would probably make more sense because I would have, let's say I have 5 active users in my system. Each one of those 5 users has 2 sessions, so I have 10 user sessions across those 5 users, and then I have to get all 10 of those session objects for all 10 user sessions for all 5 users. Or we're actually dealing with a more simplified scenario, but we're not giving the Entity Framework enough detail to know that. So it's thinking of them as dealing with collections. So, select many. The goal here is select many. It says I'm going to take each one of these sessions. Because what will happen here is if we do select from user session collection, we'll get back a collection of we'll get back a collection of sessions for every user. So if this user has 2 sessions, we'll get back a list of 2 session objects for user 1. User 2 will get back a list of 2 session objects for user 2. User 3 will get back a list of 2 session objects for user 3, and then we'll end up with a list that contains a list of session objects. Because every item in, I wish I had markers, every item in the first top of the list it represents a user, and then that user has multiple sessions. Right, this is not going to. So this line of code will do the magic to flatten it out. So this will just give us a list of sessions. Maybe the other code was better. Yes.
There's a line, red line on the line where it says row.session name, saying session is an attribute of session needs to go. It doesn't contain a definition.
Row.session.name, do you have select many, select, and then this? You have this the same?
All of that.
When you mouse over row, what does it tell you that row is?
It says row is a session UTO.
Yes. So you now need to drop session out of the middle. Because the goal here, the reason I'm doing this, is that this row now represents a session, not a session user, or user session. I'm actually consolidating further. So mine, if I try to build, I should get the same error. Yeah, so my row is now a session, just like yours. So I need to drop this. Because this row is actually now a session. Okay. So let's save. Rebuild. Rerun.
Now, the reason I went through that wasn't just for the sake of trying to really confuse you, but you'll run into those situations where you'll end up with collections of nested collections. And it happens when you do things like this. And the best way to get around them or to resolve them is that you kind of have to map it out, you kind of have to think about it, but that select mini is a really important function to use that allows you to do that flattening of those lists. I still have a breakpoint.
Or did I get stuck in an infinite loop? Oh, it loaded. Alright, guess it just took a while to compile.
So, showing you that was for demonstration more than anything.
And I didn't, in my head, it didn't expect it to be as hard to explain. So, to kind of recap what we're doing there. So we're grabbing the user session. So we're now utilizing, so this X represents our user. I can rename that to user to make it a little clearer. Call this user. Call this user. User. Okay. So we're taking that user, we're filtering it by our logged in user, and then we're grabbing the user sessions off the user UTO. We're taking that collection of user sessions, and we're basically stripping it down to just get the sessions that that user has registered for. Alright, so that's what this segment of code is doing. It's saying, take each user's user session collection, grab one user session, and then grab that session object from there. Wrap it all the way back up, and then it gives us a collection of sessions. From those sessions, we do the same work as before, where we take the session and create a session view model, and then convert that view model into a list. Okay. Now, the same could be true. Back up here for a second. So when you start thinking about your admin side and needing to list all of the sessions that a user has signed up for, or finding all the users who have registered for a particular session, right? Go the other way about it. Maybe you want to pull a particular session. I'm going to go ahead and just put it right in here. Now this wouldn't be where I wouldn't put it under the registration, but just for time, I'm not going to create a new controller and do all of that. So this would go under like a course admin controller, or course management controller, whatever you want to call it. So what I'll do is I will grab a session, get all users in the session, list users in the session. Okay? And I'll go a little slower, I'll break it down a little easier. So this will be a session DTO. We'll actually need a using project DB context, just as before. So we'll say context dot session. Oh wait, I'm sorry. Selected session equals context dot sessions. First or default async, where the ID equals the session ID parameter that's passed in. And this needs an await right there. So that'll grab the session based on the ID that we pass in. Then from here, we're going to need a list of user DTO. These will be the registered users. So what I can say now is selected session. I don't have user session yet, sessions. So let me add that property. And let me jump over there. So I'm going to hit F12. And this will actually be user sessions. So in my session DTO, I'm adding a property called user sessions, which is not a list, but it needs to be an iCollection. And it's important because the proxy that gets generated, that is the collection, it's not a list, it actually implements iCollection. It's a custom class just like that dynamic proxy class that it generates. So you want to make sure you use iCollection here and not a list. And we also want to make it virtual. So I can now say select x.user .toList. So this is a very concise version of what I did before. Basically, I'm selecting just a single session, and then from that session, I'm taking that selected session, grabbing the session user, or the user sessions off that session, who's registered, and then selecting the user DTO, and I'm putting that in a list, generating the user list for who's registered for that given session. So then here, I'm going to just output a string. And I'll create a system.text.string builder. Now a string builder allows you to dynamically append strings to one collection. So if you concatenate two strings together, you actually create a brand new string. So you end up with old string A, old string B, and you create new string C. You don't take A plus B and actually create AB. So in memory, you actually end up with three strings. And then if you append another one to it, then you end up with new string D. So you have old string A, old string B, new string C, and new string, actually old string D and new string E, because D is another string that you append to it, so then you end up with 5 strings. String Builder does true concatenation, so it limits the amount of memory that you end up consuming as you're appending strings to one another. So it's under system.text, and it's simply append, or you can do append line, however you want to do it. And then you just pass in the string that you want to append. So what I'm going to do here, so I'm going to do a for each in registered users. No. Oh, because this is within the context of the using statement. Hold on, cut, paste. I have to declare this up here. And then if registered user is not equal null, and that's going to turn into a whole event error handling deal, but this will be registered users. So string builder, append, I'll move that up, append line item dot username. So I'm basically just concatenating usernames to the string, and then I need to say user list dot toString, and then this is the part actually before I do toString, I'm going to do user list dot replace. Why is it not giving me IntelliSense? I want to replace this with a BR tag. User list. Oh, because I didn't call it user list, I called it SB. Alright, so I declared my string builder wrong. I should have called it user list, not SB. Old habit. Maybe we just call it SB. So my user list is my string builder. If my registered user does not equal null, that means I have them. Then I'm going to loop through my list of registered users. I'm going to append the username from each user into my user list. And then here I'm saying content, return content, user list, right? Collection of usernames. And then I have to convert the new line, which is a /r/n, into a BR tag. Because otherwise what will happen is on the HTML page, it'll just spit them out as continuous text. It doesn't recognize the RN. If I look at the source, I'll see them broken out with lines. But in HTML, I have to use a BR tag in order to break them. And then I have to call toString to actually convert it to a string. Alright, so F6. And this is called registered users. And then let's just assume that I have a session with the number 1. Oh, it's not ID. Session ID equals 1. Nope. Question mark. Session ID equals 1. And I'm the only user registered. So that routine has the basic mechanics to go and fetch the users that are